I'm gonna be honest with you guys, we are pretty horrible at everything that's not programming. And in order to combat that whenever we're working on games, we've been heavily relying on outside people to help us with making art or making music or doing translations for a game. And I always suggest this to you guys as well, to just outsource the parts that you're not good at. But how do you really do that? Well, that's where the sponsor of today's video comes in, Fiverr. We've been using Fiverr very extensively already since we've made Forge Industry, and now especially with Songs of Everjade, now that we have a bit more of a budget, we're really leaning into all of the different services that we can find on Fiverr that are related to game development. So the goal of today's video is to talk a bit more about what is Fiverr, if you have never heard about it, talk about our experiences that we had before when we were getting art or music or anything else really from Fiverr, and I'm also going to be talking to you a bit more about some general tips I have to make the most out of it if you are going to start working with external freelancers on your project. Now, if you have no clue what I'm talking about, Fiverr is basically an online marketplace where freelancers can advertise their services. So for example, you're an art student and you're good at art and you want to earn a little bit extra on the side, you would make a gig on Fiverr where you make certain pieces of art. Of course, there are also more professional companies on Fiverr as well, but generally it's a great platform if you're looking for a specific thing that you don't have all of the skills for, and you also feel like it's not worth learning yourself, or you just can't deal with the extra load that comes with having to learn a new skill or even just having to spend the time on it. They offer a very broad range of services and skills and things like that, so you will almost always find someone who perfectly matches the game you're working on. Now, let's start with art, because that is what we struggled with the most. And also when I did a survey a few weeks ago and I asked you guys what you struggled with the most, that was also the #1 problem. And we've just got the most experience with this. Like I said, our Forge Industry promo art, we made that one on Fiverr. It cost us about 110 euros. And it was probably the best possible return on investment we could have gotten, because we used that single piece of art as our Steam promo art. We used it when we went to events as our big banners. And we also sold individual posters even of that specific art. It was really good. The quality was like above what we could have imagined, and we've got so many people who came to us and complimented us or like just stopped by our booths at these events just because of how good the art was. So getting some really good concept art is very important. That's also what we did with Songs of Everjade. Once again, we went to Fiverr, we got an artist who could make like more of the environmental art. Again, it was a pretty good deal. It took only like a week, and now we also can reuse that piece of art throughout various pieces of media. You can find it in our YouTube banner, you can find it on our Patreon, you can find it on our Steam page, obviously, and who knows at what other places we can still reuse it. And I think that this kind of art, more of the concept art is what I would like to say, but it's not concept art in the sense of this is just a very rough sketch of where I want to go, but more concept art of I want to sell the game's vision. I think this is one of the things that you should put in investment in as fast as possible, because this gives you some of the highest return on investment. People are very visual, and it does not matter if your game is beautiful, even if your Steam page icon isn't even pretty, no one will click through and find out more about your game. Your art is going to be your first point of contact, and I know a lot of you guys, you just try and like mesh up something with Midjourney and like some Photoshop, but honestly, I have to be honest, most of the time when I see your store pages, it doesn't look that pretty. If you get one single piece of good art and then you get a nice font, like you can find hundreds of thousands of free fonts online, and you put that font, like your game's name, on the art, you've just made your entire Steam asset collection, and it's going to do wonders in terms of actually selling your game. One tip there, if you do want to use it for your Steam marketing, if you can get a person on it, people love to click faces. I'll find a study, but there was like some study at some point that store pages that had like a human face on it had a much higher click-through rate than store pages with no people on it, because we're just so visual. So that's why the art is so important. Some other things that we've been experimenting with is our pixel art as well for Songs of Everjade. I've covered this in our devlogs before, but for both our sprites as well as our characters, we've been going more to 2D pixel artists right now, because you have to keep in mind, your time has value as well. You only have this many hours, and we could learn pixel art. We are learning pixel art, but there are certain more complex things, such as for example our characters, that just take more studying. Like there's a difference between making a very simple sprite like our walls or actually making fully animated characters. Like we've been able to make our own warrior, but that sprite sheet took about 2 weeks to make, and even then it's not perfect still. It still has room for improvement, and sure, we could improve, but we could also improve the things that we're good at. We could keep coding the game, we could keep making better mechanics. So that's why we're heavily leaning into artists now. We're looking at getting pretty much all of our characters done by artists, because it's something that our team is not good at, as well as doing a lot of the tiles. Tiles are also very cheap to get commissioned. They're very cohesive if you just get them all from the same artist, and they're also very cost effective. Speaking of cost effective, sometimes there's just something you hate to do, and in our case it was rigging. For our previous game Forge Industry, we had little workers, and I had modeled the actual 3D model of the character. It doesn't really represent a humanoid structure, but it's very small because you look at it from very high above. And suddenly I had to rig it because we wanted to be able to move its arms. And I opened the YouTube, I started looking at some rigging tutorials, but it was all for humanoid characters. I had no clue what I was doing. And after wasting 2 hours trying to rig my character, I was like, actually, what am I doing? I paid $5 and within 2 hours I got a fully rigged character back, which means that I could have just done that from the beginning, realized that, hey, I'm not even gonna bother with this, sent it out, got the rigged character back, and I could move on with my life. And I would have had 2 extra hours to work. And there was also the extra cost of me being frustrated, me being like, what is this? Why am I even doing this? I don't want to do this. Even if it's something that you don't want to do, keep in mind that it could actually be worth it to outsource it. And then the next part I want to cover is music. This is something that your game is going to need regardless. You can't make a game without music. Even if it's just some ambient beep boop music, all of these things matter. And there are multiple ways you can do music. How we did it with Forge Industry is we had multiple fantasy inspired tracks and we just had a playlist that looped around them. And this allowed us to go very low cost because we had access to a bunch of licensed music that we got the license for. And we just put all of them in a playlist and we had fantasy music, which is quite generic, plenty of things out there. And we just used those, and people love the music of Forge Industry. However, we ran into a little problem with Songs of Everjade, which is the very specific setting of ancient mythological China. We found 2 songs. Those are the ones that were in our playtest build. We had 2 songs that had the instruments we wanted to use and that we could actually use legally from a licensing perspective. But there were some issues. They weren't looping. And on top of that, we also wanted to become a bit more fancy with our music. We wanted to have state shifting so that the music changes depending on if you're in combat or you're just exploring the home base or another one of the levels. And we could not do that with the 2 songs we could find. So this meant we probably needed to get some music composed. And I got depressed when I looked at how expensive composing is. I understand it's a lot of work, but it's really hard for me as an indie to just get a quote for $1,000 and it's 3 minutes of music. But in the end, I figured, hey, let's take a gamble. There was an artist on Fiverr that the samples sounded pretty good, and I sent them a message in advance. I was like, hey, do you have these instruments? This is the style I want to go for. Is this something you can do? They were like, sure. Let's go for it. And it was only $55 per minute. And honestly, I got the results back just yesterday. They sound great. Take a listen to this. So that was more of our calm music, and then this is more of our combat music. Now, I'm not a composer. I don't know if technically or mechanically these songs are perfect or not, but I'm someone who still likes to listen to a lot of music. My Spotify is I think 80 to 90,000 minutes every year. And this sounded good to me. And honestly, most of your players will just say it sounds good or this doesn't sound good. And so far the feedback we've gotten is it sounds good. So we're actually planning on continuing with this artist because it just works for us and it's more financially viable to maybe even look into getting a full OST. No promises there, but it's something that we can consider because of that better pricing. If we had to pay $250 per minute, well, our game is gonna need more 10 to 15 minutes of music. That is a lot of money that we could spend on things that I feel are more important, such as more sprites, because that's something very visual, or spending it on advertising and things like that so the game sells more to begin with. Then, because of this video being sponsored, I figured I should try out something new, and that is copywriting. This is something that I was a bit on the edge about, because first of all, there's plenty of copywriting gigs on Fiverr, but not really that much related to actual game copywriting. And then especially Steam copywriting, there was only one person. And I was like, hey, you know what? Let's just try it out. we already had our Steam page up for Songs of Everjade and it sounded all right. We have had some previous coaching calls with Grzegorz. I followed his free masterclass on making a Steam page, which is also filled with good information. I'll link that one down below because it's a really good resource if you're making your own Steam game. But regardless, I figured, hey, let's still try this out. I'll take the bullet so that you guys know if this actually worth it or not. And I send off the information about our game. I send off a build. I send off him the already existing Steam page so we had some idea of what we were talking about. And then a few days later, I got a Google Doc which included the whole copy for the Steam page. And what I really liked as well is it included like parts of place a GIF here. It's very important to have GIFs and other kinds of images in your store page, and sometimes it can be harder to imagine what exactly should I talk about here or what exactly should I showcase. It was really nice here that it was included. However, I wasn't fully happy with this one. So I want to dive in a little bit deeper about this gig because the previous one I've talked about, generally I've always been happy. I think this one was the first one where I had a bit of a more experience. It was quite expensive. It was 120 euros for a Steam page to be written. And it was from someone who had actual credibility. So this was someone who actually ran a game PR company in the UK, but I felt like there were still some things that were a bit meh. First of all, the vocabulary didn't really fit what I wanted to talk about. Like one of the words that was very often used in the original one was titans, which is not a word that fits the mythological vibe. Some other issues came around with the definition of, okay, we have some domain specific terms such as wuxia or our like giant black tortoise swanwu. And these kind of got lost in translation even though we stayed in English, but I felt like the meaning was lost a bit. So what I had to do was I had to go through the text and I basically rephrased some of the words and I was like, oh no, actually, this is a decent store page. Like, especially once I went through it, gave it like one run, it was decent. Don't get me wrong. It's on our Steam page right now. You can go and look at it. I've implemented it, but I wasn't really feeling like I got good value for my money. Honestly, if you need a Steam store page, don't spend money on him. I'm just gonna plug our Patreon right now. Get the Patreon Pro tier. It's 40 bucks. I'll sit down with you in a meeting for 45 minutes and we'll just write your store page together and I'll know exactly what you need. Okay, that was my little plug. And then once we got that marketing copy and I was happy with it, we did one final thing, and that is localization. This is something that Grzegorz talks about a lot in his game marketing courses as well, is even if you can't localize your full game in like all of the different languages, still localize it in some of the major languages such as Spanish or Portuguese, Chinese and Japanese, and maybe Korean, because there's just such a big audience for those languages. And if you just have the store page already, more people will actually see your game and maybe even wishlist it. So that's what we did. We actually got 2 different translations through Fiverr. One was in Portuguese Brazilian and one was in German. And then once we got them, I reached out to some people who were actually native and I was like, hey, does this sound okay? Like they spoke German and they were on Steam a lot, or they spoke a lot of Brazilian and they were on Steam. And we're like, hey, yeah, actually, this is pretty good. This fits what I would be looking for, and it cost us like 20 euros, which is a very good deal because probably you're going to get more than 20 wish lists, which means it's a better ROI than just doing traditional advertising in English or whatever. I think localizations can be very underrated as well to try and escape a bad saturated market. Something we noticed with Forge Industry is, okay, our English sales weren't that great, but our game was localized in Japanese and also in Danish, and even before the game came out, just on the fact that we had localized the store pages, both Denmark and Japan actually stood out in like our wishlist graph. And even now they're still above average, which allowed us to get a bit more sales. And I think localization can be a good return on investment. You just have to be more sensible. Don't go for 13 languages immediately, but look at where is my core audience going to be. If you're making a strategy game, have it localized in German, because a lot of people in Germany like strategy games, or at least, like I said, do the store page. Now, what are my overall thoughts? Because Fiverr sometimes gets a bit of a bad rep, and I do understand why. The big thing you need to keep in mind with Fiverr is that a lot of the people on there are not pros. It could be someone like a university student in maybe literature or in graphic design or whatever who's trying to make some extra money, but they're not going to be 100% dedicated to you. That's why delivery times can sometimes be a bit longer than you'd expect, or communication can be a bit iffy at points. But this does allow you to get that lower price. Fiverr also has a pro service, which I think is more of the actual professional, like you get someone who's more dedicated to you, puts a lot of effort into it. But I haven't used that one personally, because what I usually do, and this is going to be my number one advice, is send messages to people on Fiverr beforehand. Don't just see a gig and then book it. especially with things like art, for example. People ask you in advance to like, hey, message me. It's like in almost all of their descriptions, so that they can actually see, are we a good fit? You also know then, are we a good fit? Because maybe you have an artist who actually doesn't really do what you're looking for or wouldn't be able to deliver on the vision. And that immediately gives you a first vibe check of, okay, do I think this person is going to be all right to work with? If their messages take like 4 days to respond each time and like they're pretty bad in communicating, that's a pretty good sign that, hey, maybe you shouldn't do it. But I've also had people where I just sent like a message of like, hey, would this be something you're interested in? And then I got like a full sketch back already of, hey, this is what I have imagined. I hadn't even booked anything yet. And that's like, this shows me that, okay, these people actually know more what they're doing. I want to continue with them. Also, as a part of sending that message first, I think another reason why a lot of people have bad results from Fiverr is because they don't put in enough. I think if you can compare Fiverr a little bit to a large language model, the more you put into it, like information-wise, the better the output is going to be. So don't just send like a message of like, hey, I'm looking for some concept art for my game. I need a dwarf who's hammering on an anvil and there's like a city in the background, because there's too much room for interpretation. Give a little sketch, give example pictures, write out in more detail what your requirements are, because the more input you give to the artist, the better of a result they can bring. Generally, my experiences have been pretty good over the most part. With Fiverr, it just takes a little bit of extra time because I write up like a full, like I'll put on some screenshots of messages I've sent before, a full requirement list. I give them reference art, I give them something that I maybe sketched up, or I give a very like detailed notes of like something that maybe I previously generated in AI, and then I added notes of like, hey, I want this part is good, but I want these things changed. Could you do it in your style and things like that? And also ask for updates along the process. Generally, most of the times when I felt like this isn't really what I wanted is because we got a deal done and I paid for it and then I hear nothing until the final delivery. So what I do now is I always ask for updates along the way, because that way it's much easier to update, it's much easier to pivot if something isn't wrong, or to be like, hey, actually, this isn't what I wanted. If it's still in like the sketch stage versus it's already fully colored and almost practically finished, these things are important as well. Now, my general experiences, I think about 85% of all the orders I've done on Fiverr, I am actually very pleased with. Some of the things that I was a bit more iffy about was, like I said, the store page description, because there were also just simply typos in it. So if I would have just blindly copy pasted it, my store page would have been full of typos. Like I threw it in Grammarly and I got like 13 different errors, and I'm like, I feel like this could have been better, but hey, especially for the price I paid for that one, I'm still not over it. But also things like pixel art has sometimes been a bit more but never have I truly been like, oh, this was a waste of money. Everything generally was still usable, and if I just did like a little touch up, it would still be production ready. Maybe I had to change a bit of the vision, or you know, you can also just say that, because you usually get some revisions with Fiverr, be like, hey, actually, I don't really like this color of water tile, can you change it a little bit? Things like that. So if you are currently struggling with something, whether that is art or whether it is music or anything else, just look it up on Fiverr is what I would say, because chances are you're going to find someone who's just right for you. I'll also put the links to all the gigs that I have used myself in the description down below, so you can look at them as well. And maybe if one of them interests you, feel free to go ahead, place an order after you've messaged them, and use the code BITEME at checkout, as it really helps us out as well. Anyways, I hope this is something that has taught you a bit more about the world of freelancing. Fiverr gets a lot of bad rep, but I think it does offer a lot of opportunities for smaller game dev studios like us who can't just hire dedicated employees, or even just finding freelancers can take a lot of extra time. If you're new around here, we're game developers, we've made our own game, we're working on our next game, and we want to be as open and transparent as possible about game development and our journey along the way. So if that's something that you're interested in, be sure to head down below and subscribe, because we upload these videos twice a week and you'll get notified the moment we do. That's all I had to say. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!